You did the work. You sat down, you figured out who you were actually talking to, and you stopped trying to talk to everybody all at once. You got specific with your message. Maybe you even took a little bit of what Melina had to share in our last episode and started thinking about your audience in the way that a campaign strategist would. Who's already with you? Who's on the fence? And who are you actually trying to move into action? You have a message, a real one that actually shapes around the people that you're trying to reach. And then things don't go as planned. Your emails don't go out on time, or they go out, but something critical is missed. Or worse yet, someone on the team sends a different version because they couldn't find the approved one. Or maybe you put a lot of effort into planning the first time you ran the campaign, but now that you're running it for the second time, it feels like you're starting from scratch because nobody actually wrote down what you decided on the last time. The strategy was right, the message was right, but the execution fell apart. And the hard part, the part that nobody talks about enough, is that this isn't the first time. It happens again and again and again. But not because the team isn't capable and not because they don't care, but it's because there isn't a system underneath the strategy to hold it up. That's what this episode is all about. Not the message, but the infrastructure behind the message. The operational layer that either makes your communication work or quietly guarantees that it won't. I'm Noelia, and this is Ops and Outcomes, a podcast where we talk about how work actually gets done inside mission-driven organizations. This is the third episode of Land Your Message, our mini-series on nonprofit communication strategy. If you're just finding this episode, here's a quick recap of what we've covered so far. In episode 1, we talked about the foundation that most nonprofits skip in their day-to-day comms, getting specific about the audience that you're talking to before you even send a single word. Not thinking of your audience as a whole list, not everyone who's ever interacted with the organization, but instead thinking about a single person that you're trying to move into action. In episode 2, we brought a guest, Melina Duarte, a campaign and communications expert. And she brought a perspective to this conversation that I think is genuinely hard to find in the nonprofit space. If you haven't heard it, definitely go back and start there. And now we're here, episode 3. Here's the thing. Knowing your audience, crafting the right message only gets you so far. At some point, the message has to actually get out the door consistently, repeatedly, without your team feeling like they're reinventing the wheel every single time. Strategy without infrastructure is just a good idea that never actually gets delivered. Here's what I've seen happen over and over again inside small and mid-sized nonprofits. The communication planning happens. Someone, usually the communications director, sometimes an ED, sometimes an operations leader who picks up the function by default. They put some real thought into it. They think about the timing, they think about the message, they might even think carefully about who they're actually talking to, which is great. That's what we want. And then it hits the execution layer, and that's where things get complicated. Because most nonprofits don't have communications breakdown at the strategy level. They have it happen at the infrastructure level, the place where a good plan meets the reality of a small team, limited bandwidth, and systems that were never really built to support consistent communications work. The message lives in someone's head or a Google Doc that hasn't been touched all quarter, or maybe it's in an email thread that somebody started last February, but no one can find anymore. And here's the part that really gets me. This isn't just inefficiency. It's costly in ways that are easy to underestimate. Because when your team is spending time hunting down the right file or reconstructing decisions that were made 8 months ago, or sending something out that wasn't quite finished, but the deadline hit and so it had to go out, that's time and energy that isn't going towards your mission. And it compounds. Every recurring initiative you run without a solid system behind it gets a little harder instead of a little easier. So what I want to do with this episode is get specific about where breakdown actually happens, not in theory, but in practice. Because once you can see the three places where nonprofit communications fall apart in the execution layer, the fixes become a lot clearer. And the good news is, none of this requires a big budget or new hire. It simply requires intention and a little bit of operational discipline applied in the right places. The first place nonprofit communications break down is knowledge management. I know that sounds dry, like a technical term, but stay with me, because this one shows up everywhere and it costs more than the organization realizes. Here's the reality. For most nonprofits, files live in multiple places. There's a shared drive somewhere. There's a project management tool that someone set up 2 years ago, and half the team uses it, half the team doesn't. And then there's email, holding a surprising amount of information that was never supposed to live there permanently. So when someone needs to find something, they're not going to one place. They're checking 3, 4 different places. And sometimes they find what they're looking for. Sometimes they find an old version. But the reality is that most people don't have the time or the patience to endlessly look for that thing that they need. And they tend to just give up and start from scratch. For a one-time project, that can feel frustrating. But for those recurring initiatives that you're doing every year, this can be worse than that. It becomes an operational problem. Because here's what happens with recurring work. The first time you run it, someone does all the thinking. They make decisions, sometimes really specific ones, important decisions that really impact how the initiative runs. And those decisions might get communicated in the moment, maybe in a meeting, maybe over email, a conversation that happens in the hallway, but they don't always get documented. And they almost never get documented with context, the why behind the what. Let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. Say your organization runs an annual fundraising event. You sell tickets and you have a couple different discount structures in play at the same time. Maybe a specific rate for a particular segment of your donor community and a promotional early bird discount for anyone who maybe purchases a ticket before a certain date. At some point, someone had to decide, if a donor qualifies for both discounts, what happens? Do they stack? Does only one apply? If only one applies, which one? The better deal, or maybe the specific one that was originally meant for that group? That's not a small decision. It has implications for your donor relationships, your revenue, and your team's ability to answer questions confidently when people call or email about this. And here's the thing, there's no universally right answer. Maybe you decide that your special donor group absolutely should get the stacked benefit, especially if buying during that early window is something you really want to incentivize. Or maybe it doesn't make financial sense for your organization and you decide only one discount applies. Either way, it's a legitimate call. But that call needs to be documented. Who made it? What they decided? Why? And who has the authority to revisit that decision if circumstances call for it? Because when that decision lives only in the memory of the person who made it, and that person moves on or pulled on to something else, or just doesn't remember what the decision was a year later, you're back to square one. And now you're not only making that decision again, you're likely doing it without full context of why you made it in the first place. This is why I like to recommend to my clients that they create a playbook for all their core initiatives. This isn't just a process document that walks you through step by step the execution for the initiative. It's really a living record that captures decisions made along the way, the ones that shape how your initiative runs and why. When you build that kind of documentation for your recurring work, the next time you execute that initiative, you're not starting from scratch. You're starting from a foundation. You can reaffirm the approach quickly, flag anything that needs to get revisited, and get the right stakeholders involved early so you can move forward with confidence. That's not bureaucracy, that's operational leadership. The second way I see things break down for nonprofits is something I think you're going to recognize immediately. Email is doing way too much, and it's failing at most of it. Okay, this isn't anything new, and I'm not trying to criticize the way folks work. Email was designed to do one thing, send messages. But at some point, it became the default system for documenting decisions, storing files, tracking action items, and it works until it doesn't. Think about how many times you've been in this situation. Something needs to get done, and the context for it, the background, the decisions, the approved revisions to a particular document lives somewhere in an email thread. Maybe you remember roughly when it was sent. Maybe you have an idea of what the search terms would be to be able to find it and pull it up. Maybe you even find it in 5 minutes. Maybe you spend like 20 minutes looking for it. Are those 20 minutes well spent? How about attachments? We've all had those attachments that come in and say final, but then there's a reply down the line, maybe a few weeks later, that says final, final. And so when you search for it later, you're not sure which one is the one that you should be using. This is not a productivity problem. This is a systems problem. And it happens because email is frictionless to use in the moment. It's always open. It's how you're already communicating. It's easy to just hit reply and attach something. So it becomes the path of least resistance for everything, including things it was never built to handle. What actually belongs in email? Communications, outreach, relationship building, the things email was actually designed for. What doesn't belong in email? Decisions that need to be findable later, files that are going to be referenced again, action items that need to be tracked, and project documentation that is really institutional knowledge. Those things need a home, and it isn't your inbox. Whether it's a shared document, a project management tool, a dedicated folder structure, the specific solution matters less than the principle. I encourage you to stop using email like it's an archive tool. It really isn't. And every time you treat it like one, you're making future you work a lot harder than they need to. The third breaking point is one that lives right at the intersection of communications and operations. It's one I think gets overlooked because it's so easy to miss from the inside. When someone in your community wants to take the next step, learn more, access a resource, sign up for something, maybe it's finding something that you mentioned, where do they go? For most nonprofits, honestly, the answer is it depends. It depends on which link you included in a particular email or post. It depends whether your website has been updated recently. It depends whether a resource you're pointing them to actually is where it was supposed to be. What does your audience experience? In a lot of cases, it's friction, and friction kills follow through. Now, in our last episode, Melina touched on something I thought was really smart. The idea of thinking carefully about where you're sending people and making sure that destination is doing its job. I want to build on that here because I think that's an operational layer that really is worth naming. I'm going to call this idea the front door, one intentional, well-maintained place where your most important resources live, where you can confidently send people regardless of the context. But here's my addition to the idea. It shouldn't include everything. That's the trap. You build a link page or a resource hub and you put everything on it because you're not sure what people will need. And suddenly it's a cluttered menu and it's harder to navigate than just searching your website. The front door should only include things that your audience reaches for most. The things that you find yourself reaching for repeatedly or that people are asking you for regularly. Keep it lean, keep it intentional. And you can actually have more than one version of this. A public-facing front door for your community and for the things that they need most, and an internal version for your team. The playbooks, the templates, the reference documents that they're reaching for and looking for when it comes to executing your core initiatives. And I'll take it one step further. Imagine having a version that's essentially a front door for all of your organization's playbooks. Every core initiative organized, accessible in one place. Your team isn't hunting. Your new staff member isn't asking someone where they can find something. It's just there. That's not a complicated thing to build, but requires someone to decide it matters and to really take ownership over it. I want to leave you with a picture of what the other side of this looks like. Picture this. Your annual gala is coming up. 6 weeks out, someone on your team opens the playbook. Not a folder with 17 different documents with no clear order. A single organized reference that walks you through how the event runs, the process, the timelines, the vendors, the contacts, the approved messages, and yes, all of the decisions. The team doesn't spend a week reconstructing what they did last time. Instead, they spend 15 minutes reviewing what's already there, confirming what still applies, and flagging anything that needs to be updated before moving forward. The communications go out on time, not because someone stayed late to pull it together, but because the infrastructure made it possible. The audience gets clear, consistent messages. They click the links that take them exactly where they're intended to go. The resources are there that they're looking for, and the friction is gone. And here's the thing, it feels different for the team too. There's a different energy when you're executing from a foundation instead of rebuilding from scratch. It's not just more efficient, it's less demoralizing. People can actually focus on the work that matters instead of the work of finding the work. That's what operational leadership looks like. Not glamorous, but the things that quietly make everything possible. And that's exactly the kind of work this podcast exists to talk about. So let's bring this all the way home. Over the course of the series, we covered a lot of ground. In episode 1, we talked about what it actually means to know your audience, not as a concept, but in practice. Getting specific about who you're trying to move and shape your message around that person instead of trying to reach everyone at once. In episode 2, Melina brought a perspective that I think is genuinely rare in this space. What it looks like to communicate with the kind of strategic discipline that campaign communications use, and what nonprofits can take from that world and apply it to their own. And in this episode, we got into the part that doesn't always make it into the strategy conversation, the systems and the habits that determine whether your communications actually get out the door and land with the right person. These systems and habits, they're meant to get easier over time, not harder. Because here's what I want you to take away from this series. A great message shaped around the right audience, delivered through a system that actually works, that's not a luxury. That's the baseline. That's what it looks like when communications work is well done. A key thing to remember here is that whether or not you own this, whether you're the communications leader or the operations leader, or maybe you're the ED wearing all of the different hats at once, someone has to decide that infrastructure matters just as much as the message. If this series resonated with you, if any of the episodes felt like they were speaking directly to the work you're doing, the best next step is to join our Ops and Outcomes newsletter. That's where I go deep into the systems, the frameworks, the strategies that help mission-driven organizations run better. The link to subscribe is in the show notes. I'd love to have you over there. This work that you're doing, the unglamorous, behind the scenes, hold everything together work, it matters. And this podcast exists because it deserves to be talked about. See you in the next episode.